Okay, so leaving a job can be, well, a whole thing, right? And the absolute last thing you want to deal with is a fight over your final paycheck. But what if your old boss says, you're not getting a dime until you return that company laptop or car, or in this case, a house? Today we are diving deep into a huge Supreme Court case that answers that exact question.
So let's just put it out there. This is the big question. Imagine you've put in your 2 weeks, your last day is done, you're ready to move on. But there's a problem. Maybe you still have some company property. Can your former employer legally hold your hard-earned final pay hostage until you give it back? Well, we're about to find out.
So here's our game plan. First, we'll look at the company at the center of this whole story, Solid Mills. Then we'll get into the big disagreement. After that, we'll follow the wild ride this case took through the courts. We'll see what the Supreme Court ultimately decided, and we'll unpack the why behind their decision. And finally, we'll talk about what this whole thing means for employees and employers everywhere.
All right, let's set the scene. Our story kicks off with a company called Solid Mills Incorporated. For a long time, they were a pretty big deal, a major employer. But by the early 2000s, Solid Mills was in deep financial trouble. Now, one of the perks of working there was pretty unique. The company let a lot of its employees live in company-owned houses in a community called SMI Village. The court papers actually say this was offered out of the company's liberality, basically their generosity. But in 2003, the other shoe dropped. Solid Mills announced it was shutting down for good. And this is right where the whole shutdown hits a massive roadblock. It sparked a huge conflict between the company and all those employees living on its property. And believe it or not, the entire fight hinged on just 2 words in an agreement. Yep, the whole dispute really boils down to this little phrase: less accountabilities. The company's closure agreement promised everyone their separation pay and all their other benefits, but with that one little catch: less accountabilities. You're going to want to remember that phrase because it is everything in this story. So you can see how this led to a total standoff. On one side, you have the employees demanding their money, separation pay, 13th month pay, all of it. On the other side, the company said, sure, but only after you sign this quitclaim saying you'll leave the company housing. The employees refused to sign, and the company refused to pay. Classic impasse.
With both sides completely dug in, there was only one place to go: court. But this was not a simple open and shut case. As it worked its way up the legal system, different judges came to totally opposite conclusions. It was a real legal roller coaster.
So check out this back and forth. First, the labor arbiter sided with the employees. They said, hey, withholding pay is illegal and the housing thing is a totally separate issue. But then the NLRC came in and completely flipped the script, saying the company was actually justified. Then the Court of Appeals agreed with the NLRC. So, of course, there was only one place left to go: the Supreme Court.
So, after years of legal battles, the case finally landed at the very top, with the Supreme Court of the Philippines. This was it, the final definitive answer that would settle this dispute once and for all.
And the verdict? It was crystal clear. The Supreme Court denied the employees' petition. They upheld the decisions from the NLRC and the Court of Appeals, handing a decisive victory to the company, Solid Mills. And here it is, the one sentence from the decision that sets the precedent. The court said, and I'm quoting directly, an employer is allowed to withhold terminal pay and benefits pending the employee's return of its properties. Wow, that statement basically changed the game.
Okay, so that's what the court decided. But why did they rule that way? This wasn't just a random call. The entire decision was built on a really solid legal foundation, and it all comes back to that phrase we talked about: less accountabilities.
The court basically said, let's use the plain, ordinary meaning of accountability. It's an obligation, it's a debt. They completely rejected the idea that it only meant, work tools or a uniform. Their view was much broader. If the obligation exists because you were an employee, it counts as an accountability. Simple as that.
So the court laid out its logic in 4 really clear steps. 1. That agreement, the MOA, was a binding contract. 2. The employees only got to live in the village because they worked for Solid Mills. So when the job ended, giving back the house became an accountability. 3. This is even backed up by the Civil Code, which lets employers withhold wages for a debt due. And number 4, and this is a big one, it's about fairness. They wanted to prevent something called unjust enrichment, which is just a legal way of saying one person can't unfairly profit at someone else's expense. All right, so we've got the verdict and we've got the legal thinking behind it. But what does all of this mean for you and me in the real world? Let's break down the practical lessons from this huge case. So what's the bottom line here? First, you know that whole company clearance process you have to go through to get your final pay? Well, this case cements that as being totally legal. Second, that word accountabilities is broad. It can mean anything you owe the company because of your job. But here's what's really important. This isn't about letting a company just cancel your pay. It's about making that payment conditional. You hold up your end of the deal, they'll hold up theirs. The court aimed for balance, making it clear that this right isn't a license for abuse.
So there you have it. The law is now clear. An employer does have the right to make sure they get their property back before they settle up on the final pay. Now that you know the legal thinking behind it, how does that change the way you look at the whole clearance process the next time you, or maybe someone you know, decides to leave a job?